So, my name is Taylor Sherman, and I will be going over the quotes I chose for What You Pawn, I Will Redeem, focusing on themes identity and alcoholism. For the first one, I chose the very opening scene where he describes himself. I believe this quote often describes his identity, specifically because he talks about how he's a heartbreaker and he seems to affect other people, but he knows that he disappears and he keeps disappearing and moving all over the place throughout his life. And so I chose this picture at the bottom here where there's a man alone and he's kind of looking at the world. I believe this connects because this is sort of how he views himself in a way. For the next quote, I chose the scene where the pawn shop owner kind of asks, like, is that really your name, Jackson Jackson? And he kind of says, yeah, my family's kind of funny sometimes because he named him Jackson Squared. I also find this one to be connected with identity because it connects what he sees in his family and how you can see how he kind of likes his family. He always kind of found him funny. It's either that or honestly it might be sarcasm, but I'm going to go with the idea that he dislikes his family. I chose a picture right here. It shows a kind of laughing family. They seem to be really happy. I believe that it kind of connects because of how he described his family here at the bottom. This next one talked about how when he and his friends bought about like 3 bottles of alcohol and they downed them all and then passed out in an alleyway. I kind of thought this one was a little dark, connected definitely with alcoholism because you could see how him and his friends were obviously very deeply affected and they're kind of irresponsible sometimes how they were treating their problems with alcoholism. And it's very unsafe, and I kind of thought that was very dark and sort of scary, and so I chose this photo right here of a very dark and dangerous looking alleyway. You could see there's fences on the windows, graffiti all over the walls. Doesn't seem like a very safe place, and I think that can kind of be reflected in the way they acted, which both connects to identity and alcoholism at the same time. For the next one, you could see how Jackson Jackson seemed to be treating himself kind of neglectfully. You could see how he's very common to the idea that he gets sick a lot because of possibly his alcoholism or just his behaviors in general. I believe this one also connects with identity and alcoholism because you could see that this is not something new that he goes through, but at the same time, it might be due to the alcoholism he seems to deal with. He also seems to smoke a lot. Maybe it has something to do with that as well. Either way, I chose this photo here to connect with it because there is a person here on the road. This photo is called Neglected, and I believe there's a person under here, either that or it's an animal or something or another. But either way, you could see that it's just being covered up, but nobody else seems to be doing anything about it. It's kind of a sad sort of picture in a way, and I believe it can connect to him and in a way of how he seems to treat himself. This photo here, or this quote as well, kind of describes how Jackson seemed to be a little irresponsible again with his alcoholism, but he seemed to be ignorant as well because he was asking where his friends were, and the bartender told him they were long gone, as most people should be when it's late at night and they've had a lot to drink. And so I chose this photo here, which connects to both the alcoholism and the ignorance that Jackson seemed to have in this moment, because this person seemed to be alone in a very confusing pathway, sort of possibly ignorant to where they are. I think that's kind of how I interpreted it. So yeah, I believe this one connects to identity and as well as alcoholism because alcoholism is definitely a part of his identity, and he is kind of ignorant sometimes to how he should be treating himself, also seen as the last quote I showed you. Alright, so for this quote, I thought it had a lot to do with irony because at the very end he's kind of comparing Indians and Jewish people to having a good sense of humor because of their very kind of sad past, as in like genocide and the brutality they faced. So I believe this one definitely also applies to identity because they talk about the cultures that both of them have faced and how it might be affecting them today. And so I chose this photo here. I thought the photo that this was, oh my gosh, the title of this photo was actually Irony. You could see how there's a large sign here that says economy, and it's pointing at this gas station where there's like lots of fuel dispenses and with these really large trucks that might kind of like, I guess in a way, harm the environment because I know they kind of dispense a lot of like CO2. In a way, this can be ironic because you wouldn't want something like that to rule the economy, and yet it sort of does, doesn't it? Alright, so for this next quote, this was the scene with the cop and Jackson and how the cop kind of offered, I'll get the regalia back for you, just let me help you, and Jackson kind of denied him, saying he wants to do it himself, be heroic in that way. This one also had a lot to do with identity because that's how you could see how Jackson views himself. He's a lot more humble here, saying that he wants to just do something on his own, even though he's offered help. And so I chose this photo at the top where there's this guy and he's kind of standing on a very precarious edge. He seems kind of in a heroic stance, even though it's very dangerous. And so you could see that even though you can see that he doesn't mind where he is, and he's looking kind of proud doing it. So I kind of related that to how Jackson might view himself in this situation. So for this next quote, you could see it's kind of sad because of the picture. You could see how Jackson sort of figured, like he found out that his friend Junior died of exposure in an alley behind a hotel. And so this one has a lot to do with alcoholism, I'm assuming, because he says that he kind of, well, he made a bad choice, right? He hitchhiked and then he kind of neglected himself, just like Jackson did. And I would assume that because of their past action, it might be due to their alcoholism, which also plays a number in the way that they treat themselves. And so this one has a part to do with alcoholism, and I believe that this picture here kind of describes that. It's very dark and dreary. I believe this is a picture of a motel. I didn't just choose any normal one. This one is very dark, and you can see it's kind of creepy in a way due to the nature of the quote. So for this quote, this one has a lot to do with the story that Jackson told about his great-grandfather, I believe, and how he murdered the wife of his brother, I believe. And he kind of was questioning his identity, like, why did I do that? Because it wasn't in their nature. And so that one has a lot to do with identity in this sense. And I chose this photo of a person wearing a mask. They kind of seem a little lost or confused as to who they are, which is exactly what was happening in the quote. He was trying to figure out who he was because he did something that was so out of his kind of character. This is the last quote. This one describes how Jackson finally got his grandmother's regalia back, and he feels really freeing doing it. He feels like a big sense of serenity. And so this one has a lot to do with identity because you could tell that he has a lot of impact, like with his culture. When he was kind of reunited with the regalia, you could see he felt very serene and free. And so I chose this photo of a person who also seems to feel the same way. They're kind of in a very pretty place, covered in feathers. Seems like a really freeing mood happening there. And so that's why I chose that one. And then I also have my works cited right here and right here.